All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful, but honestly, one of the most overlooked processes in all of project management: monitor communications. This is all about building that ultimate feedback loop, making sure your project's message doesn't just get sent, but that it actually lands and drives the results you need. Let's dive in.
You know the feeling, right? We've all been there. You spend hours, you craft that perfect status report, you send out all the timely updates, you hold all the right meetings, but you're left with that nagging question in the back of your mind: is any of this actually working? Is anyone even reading this stuff? And the big one, is it changing behavior and driving action? That uncertainty, that's exactly what we're going to solve today. So, here's our game plan. We're going to break this down into 5 key parts. First, we'll talk about the problem, what I call the communication blind spot. Then, we'll look at the inputs you need, kind of like your dashboard. We'll cover the tools you'll use, and then the crucial outputs that create real change. And finally, we'll tie it all together, closing that all-important feedback loop.
Okay, so let's jump right into section 1. Let's shine a bright light on this communication blind spot. What is it really, and why is it so incredibly critical to get a handle on it?
Well, the PMBOK guide defines it pretty simply, but it's powerful. It's the process of making sure your communication actually meets your stakeholders' needs. The whole goal, as the guide says, is to create an optimal information flow. Think about that. Not a fire hose of data, and definitely not just a trickle of updates, but the right information to the right people at the right time.
Now this, right here, this is probably the most important slide. You have to understand the huge difference between managing communications and monitoring them. Managing is the physical act of sending. You create the report, you hit send on the email. It's all about the output. But monitoring, that's all about verifying effectiveness. It asks the tough questions. Did that report actually achieve its goal? Did that meeting change anyone's mind? See the shift? The focus goes from output to outcome. It's a total game changer.
I love this analogy. It's the perfect way to think about it. If your project is an information factory, just churning out reports and updates and emails all day long, well then Monitor Communications is your quality control department. It's the team that inspects every single piece of information to make sure it's not just getting sent, but that it's clear, it's understood, and it's actually having the impact you intended.
Okay, so to run quality control, we need data. We need something to measure against. So let's talk about the imports. Think of these as your monitoring dashboard, all the key documents and data points that tell you what's really happening out there. The PMBOK guide gives us a really clear list of inputs. Essentially, you're gathering evidence. First, you pull up your plans, your communications and stakeholder engagement plans. That's your blueprint. It's what you intended to do. Then you dig into your project documents. And let me tell you, the issue log is an absolute goldmine here. You might see the same misunderstanding popping up again and again from one department. Well, that's a huge red flag pointing to a communication breakdown. And finally, you get the raw work performance data. How many emails went out, which reports got published. That's your baseline. So you've got your dashboard loaded up with all this data. Now what do you do with it? That brings us to our toolkit, the specific techniques and systems you're going to use to turn all that raw data into powerful, meaningful insights. And let's be really clear here, this isn't just about crunching numbers in a spreadsheet. The most effective toolkit is a balance. It's got hard data analysis for sure, but it also relies on essential, on-the-ground human insight. So a primary tool for the data analysis part is the Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix. This thing is fantastic. You map out your key stakeholders, and then you assess their current level of engagement. Are they unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, or leading? Then, right next to that, you define the desired level you need from them for the project to win. So let's say your main sponsor needs to be leading, but the matrix shows they're only supportive. That gap between current and desired, that is pure gold. It's your call to action. It's screaming at you that your current communication strategy for them isn't working. But like I said, numbers don't tell the whole story. And that's where interpersonal skills come in as a key tool. The PMBOK specifically calls out observation and conversation. This is about getting out from behind your computer screen. It's about noticing that in the weekly stand-up, the entire engineering team gets a confused look on their face every time the marketing team gives an update. That look, that observation is data. It tells you something is getting lost in translation between those two departments, a problem you'd never ever find in a spreadsheet. And finally, of course, there's your Project Management Information System, or PMIS. This is just your tech stack, right? Your SharePoint, your Jira, your Slack, whatever tools you use. The key here is that it's not just a place to dump files. In this process, you're actively using it as a monitoring tool. Are people actually clicking the link to the design mockups you sent? Are tasks in Jira being updated after a big announcement? Your PMIS gives you that digital trail of engagement, showing you what information is actually being used and what's just being ignored.
Okay, so we've gathered our inputs, we've used our tools to analyze everything. This leads us to the most important part of all, the outputs. Because the entire point of monitoring is to create actionable intelligence that drives real, meaningful change on your project.
This is really where the process gets all its power. You're making a shift. You're going from being just a passive observer of communication problems to becoming an active agent of influence, using actual data to justify and implement improvements.
This shows you the formal action loop. So, you monitor and you spot a problem. Remember that stakeholder who was stuck and resistant? You analyze that and create work performance information, which is just data plus context. It's the story of why they're resistant. Based on that story, you submit a formal change request. So what does that actually look like? Well, it could be a formal proposal to kill the weekly email update for that stakeholder and replace it with a biweekly 15-minute sync meeting, because your data shows the emails are just being ignored. It's a specific, data-backed proposal that then goes through the formal change control process to get approved and implemented. This is how you systematically fix these problems. And beyond just those formal change requests, your monitoring efforts will lead to other really critical updates. You'll be constantly refining your communications and stakeholder engagement plans based on what you've learned actually works. You'll log new communication challenges in the issue log, and this is so important, you capture these insights in the lessons learned register. This creates a cycle of continuous improvement, not just for this project, but for every project that comes after it. Which brings us to our final section, closing the loop. Let's pull everything we've talked about together into one clear, powerful takeaway. Just like we said at the very beginning, the PMBOK guide is crystal clear on this. The key benefit, the whole point of this process, is to create an optimal information flow. And optimal means it's effective and it's efficient. It means your stakeholders get the information they need, and only what they need, to make good decisions and support the project, without getting buried in noise. So if you remember one thing, let it be this. We have to shift our entire mindset. Stop measuring your success by the number of reports you send out. Start measuring it by the outcomes those communications create. Are stakeholders more engaged? Are issues getting resolved faster? Is the project actually moving forward? That is the true measure of effective communication.
So I'll leave you with this question to really think about. What's the biggest communication blind spot on your project right now? You know, that one area where you're just sending information out into the void and hoping for the best? Based on what we've just covered, what's one small step you can take starting today to begin monitoring its effectiveness and start closing that feedback loop?